On January 16, 1945, Adolf Hitler descended into the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. He would never see daylight again. The regime that had promised a 1,000-year Reich collapsed in just 105 days. The Nazi leadership, built on absolute loyalty to the Führer, disintegrated not through military defeat alone, but through a cascade of betrayals, paranoia, and structural failures that began at the very top. Within weeks of Hitler's final retreat underground, his most trusted lieutenants would negotiate secretly with the enemy, his designated successor would be branded a traitor, and the command structure that had terrorized Europe would fracture into competing fiefdoms, grasping for survival. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed the war forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The Nazi state was never designed to survive without Hitler. From its inception, the regime operated on the Führerprinzip, the leader principle, which concentrated all authority in one man. Every oath sworn by Wehrmacht officers, SS commanders, and party functionaries bound them personally to Hitler, not to Germany, not to the state, but to him. This system worked with brutal efficiency during conquest, when Hitler's strategic gambles in Poland, France, and the early Soviet campaigns produced stunning victories. But the structure contained a fatal flaw. It created no mechanism for orderly succession, no institutional continuity, no distributed authority that could function if the center failed. Hitler deliberately fostered rivalry among his subordinates, Hermann Göring, Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, ensuring none could accumulate enough independent power to challenge him. Each competed for proximity to the Führer, for his favor, for scraps of authority. They built empires within the empire. Göring controlled the Luftwaffe and the four-year plan. Himmler commanded the SS and the entire police apparatus. Goebbels dominated propaganda and civilian morale. Bormann controlled access to Hitler himself. As long as Hitler remained vigorous and decisive, this system of controlled chaos held together. But by January 1945, that central pillar had begun to crack. The military situation accelerated the regime's internal decomposition. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet offensive launched on January 12th shattered German defensive lines in Poland. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front smashed through Wehrmacht positions with overwhelming force. Within days, Soviet armored spearheads advanced over 300 miles, reaching the Oder River by the end of January, just 40 miles from Berlin. In the West, the failure of the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last major gamble, had exhausted Germany's strategic reserves. By February, Allied forces crossed the Rhine. The Ruhr pocket, Germany's industrial heartland, was encircled in early April. On April 18th, Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B, trapped with 317,000 men and 24 generals, ceased organized resistance. Model himself walked into a forest near Duisburg and shot himself. The Wehrmacht's fighting strength had evaporated. By April 1945, German forces had suffered over 11 million total casualties since 1939, with more than 1.1 million soldiers dying in just the first 5 months of 1945 alone. Divisions existed on paper as hollow shells. Infantry battalions fielded 200 men instead of 800. Tank companies counted 3 operational vehicles instead of 17. The Volkssturm, the People's Assault Militia, pressed boys under 16 and men over 60 into service with rifles from the previous century. Yet the Nazi leadership did not prepare for defeat. They prepared for succession. On March 19th, Hitler issued the Nero Decree, ordering the destruction of all German infrastructure, factories, bridges, power plants, transportation networks, to deny them to the advancing Allies. The order revealed Hitler's mental state with chilling clarity. If Germany could not win, Germany deserved to perish. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production, understood the decree's genocidal implications. Destroying the infrastructure would guarantee mass starvation and the complete collapse of civil society. For the first time, Speer directly defied Hitler. On March 18th, the day before the decree, he submitted a memorandum arguing that Germany's economic capacity had already been destroyed by Allied bombing and that the war was militarily lost. He urged Hitler to consider the German people's survival. Hitler rejected the assessment with fury. In meetings during late March, Speer continued to obstruct implementation of the Nero Decree, quietly instructing Gauleiters and military commanders to ignore demolition orders. Hitler, isolated in the bunker with incomplete information, never realized the extent of Speer's insubordination until it was too late. The Führer's absolute authority, once unquestioned, had become conditional. The disintegration accelerated through April. Soviet forces launched the final assault on Berlin on April 16th. 2 million Red Army troops, supported by 250 tanks and 41,600 artillery pieces, attacked from the east and south. Zhukov's forces crossed the Silo Heights at horrific cost, the bloodiest battle of 1945, and by April 21st reached Berlin's outer defensive ring. Konev's forces advanced from the south. On April 25th, the two fronts linked up west of Berlin, completely encircling the city. Inside the Führerbunker, the atmosphere shifted from denial to paranoia. Hitler insisted that phantom armies would relieve the capital. SS General Felix Steiner's force, supposedly assembling north of Berlin, would attack and break the Soviet encirclement. The 12th Army under General Walter Wenck would attack from the southwest. Neither force existed as combat-effective units. When staff officers gently informed Hitler that Steiner's attack had not materialized, Hitler erupted in the most violent rage his subordinates had witnessed. He screamed for hours, declaring that he had been betrayed by cowards, that the Wehrmacht had failed him, that everyone had lied to him. Then his voice dropped. For the first time, he acknowledged the war was lost. He would remain in Berlin and die in the capital. This admission triggered the succession crisis that would destroy what remained of regime cohesion. Hermann Göring, designated Hitler's successor since 1941, was in Bavaria at the Berghof. On April 23rd, he received garbled reports that Hitler intended to remain in Berlin and fight to the death. Göring faced an impossible dilemma. A 1941 decree named him Hitler's successor in the event Hitler was unable to govern. If Hitler died in Berlin, authority would transfer to Göring. But if Hitler was still alive, and Göring assumed power without permission, he would be guilty of treason. Göring sent a carefully worded telegram to the bunker. "My Führer, in view of your decision to remain at your post in the fortress of Berlin, do you agree that I take over at once the total leadership of the Reich, with full freedom of action at home and abroad, as your deputy?" He added that if he received no reply by 10 p.m., he would assume Hitler's consent and act accordingly. The telegram was rational, procedurally correct, and politically suicidal. Martin Bormann, Hitler's secretary and gatekeeper, intercepted the message. Bormann had long despised Göring and saw an opportunity to eliminate a rival. He presented the telegram to Hitler as proof of Göring's treachery, that the Reichsmarschall was attempting a coup, that he was demanding power while Hitler still lived. Hitler, already unbalanced by rage and despair, accepted Bormann's interpretation. On April 25th, Hitler sent a telegram stripping Göring of all offices and ordering his house arrest. One successor eliminated. The second betrayal followed within hours and struck even deeper. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, and commander of the most feared organization in Nazi Germany, had been conducting secret peace negotiations with the Western Allies. Through Count Folke Bernadotte, vice president of the Swedish Red Cross, Himmler met on April 23rd and proposed German surrender to Britain and the United States, but not to the Soviet Union. Himmler believed he could split the Allied coalition, offering Germany's remaining forces to fight alongside the West against Bolshevism. The offer was delusional. The Allies had committed to unconditional surrender and would accept nothing less. On April 28th, the BBC broadcast news of Himmler's negotiations. The report reached the bunker. Hitler's reaction was volcanic. Himmler, der treue Heinrich, loyal Heinrich, the man who had built the SS, who had organized the final solution, who had sworn absolute obedience, had negotiated with the enemy. It was, Hitler declared, the worst betrayal in human history. He ordered Himmler's immediate arrest and execution. The order was meaningless. Himmler was not in Berlin. The SS command structure, still theoretically loyal to Himmler, had fragmented into regional power centers. But one man connected to Himmler was in the bunker. SS Gruppenführer Hermann Fegelein, Himmler's liaison officer and husband of Eva Braun's sister, had attempted to flee Berlin. He was captured, brought back, and interrogated. Under questioning, Fegelein revealed Himmler's negotiations. On April 28th, Hitler ordered Fegelein's execution. He was taken into the Chancellery garden and shot. 2 successors eliminated. On April 29th, after midnight, Hitler dictated his last will and political testament. The documents revealed a mind that had learned nothing and admitted nothing. He blamed the Jews for starting the war. He blamed the generals for losing it. He blamed everyone except himself. Then he addressed succession. Göring and Himmler were expelled from the party for treason. Hitler appointed a new government to replace them. Joseph Goebbels would become Reich Chancellery. But Goebbels had already decided to die with Hitler in the bunker, a decision Hitler knew and approved. For head of state and commander of the armed forces, Hitler designated Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the Kriegsmarine. The choice shocked everyone. Dönitz was a naval officer, competent and loyal, but he had no political base, no party connections, no experience in governance. He had been chosen precisely because he was not part of the inner circle's power struggles, because he was still in the north with his submarines, because Hitler trusted him to continue fighting. The testament was typed, witnessed, and signed at 4 a.m. on April 29th. Hours later, Hitler married Eva Braun. On April 30th, at approximately 3:30 p.m., Hitler and Eva Braun committed suicide. Their bodies were carried to the Chancellery garden, doused with gasoline, and burned. The man who had held the Nazi regime together was gone. But the regime did not end. It metastasized. Dönitz, headquartered in Flensburg near the Danish border, received word of his appointment on May 1st. He established what became known as the Flensburg government and appointed a cabinet. Goebbels, who Hitler had named Chancellor, died in the bunker on May the 1st, poisoning his 6 children before he and his wife committed suicide. Dönitz's government had no authority, no territory, no resources, and no legitimacy, but it existed. For 23 days, the Flensburg government attempted to function. Dönitz focused on 2 objectives: negotiating surrender terms to save as many German soldiers and civilians as possible from Soviet captivity, and preserving some form of German administrative continuity. On May 7th, General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces at General Eisenhower's headquarters in Reims, France. A second signing ceremony took place in Berlin on May 8th, with Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signing before Soviet, American, British, and French representatives. The European war was over. Yet Dönitz's government remained. The Allies allowed it to continue temporarily because they needed a functioning German authority to transmit surrender orders to scattered Wehrmacht units still fighting in Norway, the Balkans, and isolated pockets. But on May 23rd, British forces arrested Dönitz and his entire cabinet in Flensburg. The Flensburg government, the last vestige of Nazi authority, ceased to exist. The Third Reich had lasted exactly 12 years, 3 months, and 8 days. The collapse was structural, not accidental. The Nazi leadership depended entirely on Hitler's physical presence and mental coherence. When both failed, the system devoured itself. Göring's telegram was not a betrayal but a rational attempt to transfer power according to established procedure, yet it was interpreted as treason because the regime ran on paranoia, not law. Himmler's negotiations were motivated by self-preservation and a delusional belief that his SS credentials might save him. But they revealed that even the most ideologically committed Nazi leaders abandoned Hitler when survival demanded it. Speer's defiance of the Nero Decree showed that bureaucratic loyalty had limits when faced with national annihilation. The speed of the collapse reflected the artificiality of Nazi governance. The regime had no deep institutional roots, no constitutional legitimacy, no tradition of civilian oversight. It was a militarized dictatorship held together by terror, propaganda, and the cult of one man. When that man retreated underground and then died, there was nothing beneath to support the weight of the state. The Wehrmacht's surrender unfolded in stages that mirrored the leadership disintegration. On May 2nd, German forces in Italy surrendered. On May 4th, German forces in northwest Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark surrendered to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. On May 5th, Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedeberg surrendered all German naval forces. On May 7th, the final unconditional surrender was signed. Over 300,000 German soldiers had become prisoners in the Ruhr pocket alone. Millions more surrendered in the following days, desperate to avoid Soviet captivity. Wehrmacht casualties in the final month of the war exceeded 400,000. The Eastern Front, which had consumed over 9 million German casualties since 1941, claimed its final victims in the smoking ruins of Berlin, where 78,000 Wehrmacht and Volkssturm troops died defending a city that had no strategic value and could not be held. The Nazi party structure, the Gauleiter system that had administered the regime's territorial divisions, evaporated even faster than the military. Regional party leaders fled, destroyed records, or attempted to negotiate local surrenders. The Gauleiters, once powerful satraps who ruled their districts with near absolute authority, found themselves abandoned by the center and hunted by advancing Allied armies. Some committed suicide, some were captured immediately. A few escaped and lived under false identities for years or decades. The party that had enrolled over 8 million members by 1945 vanished almost overnight. There was no Nazi resistance movement, no guerrilla campaign, no last stand by fanatics. The regime had invested so much authority in Hitler personally that when he died, the entire ideological edifice collapsed. Soldiers who had fought with fanatical determination weeks earlier now surrendered en masse. Officials who had administered genocide shredded files and burned uniforms. The collapse exposed the regime's ultimate weakness. It had built nothing sustainable. Conquest required only will and violence. Governance required institutions, legitimacy, competence, and trust, qualities the Nazi state deliberately destroyed in others and never cultivated in itself. When crisis came, when Hitler's judgment failed, when military defeats mounted, the leadership had no mechanisms to adapt, no traditions of collective decision-making, no habit of honest assessment. Instead, they consumed each other in a final spasm of purges and paranoia. The regime that had murdered millions in the name of racial purity ended in a bunker beneath a burning city, its leaders swallowing cyanide or fleeing in disguise, its successor government lasting 3 weeks before arrest, its 1,000-year Reich reduced to rubble and historical infamy in 12 years. History remembers the collapse not for its speed, but for what it revealed. The Nazi leadership did not fall apart in 1945. It had always been fractured, held together only by terror and the magnetic force of Hitler's will. When that will faltered and then ceased, the fractures became visible, the rivalries turned murderous, and the entire structure imploded. The lesson was clear and cold. Dictatorship, no matter how powerful, no matter how terrifying, is fragile. It depends on one man, and men are mortal. The regime that promised eternity could not survive a single season without its founder. The leadership that had demanded absolute loyalty from others showed none to each other when survival was at stake. In the end, the Nazi collapse was fast, because there was nothing real beneath the propaganda, nothing solid beneath the uniforms, nothing lasting beneath the fear. When Hitler died, the regime died with him, and what remained was not aftermath but epilogue, a government in name only, waiting for the inevitable arrest, the trials, the reckoning. The Third Reich ended not with a battle or a final stand, but with a surrender signed by men who no longer believed in anything except avoiding Soviet capture, and with the arrest of a phantom government that commanded nothing and controlled less. The collapse was total, the ending absolute, and the historical judgment remains. A regime built on one man's will cannot survive that man's death, and a leadership structure built on betrayal will end in betrayal complete and final. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.